Good evening and welcome back to CNN Money Switzerland. I'm Ana Maria Montero, and here are your headlines this Monday. Europe's economies have started to reopen, and that means we're beginning to go back to work. But we will be paying for the coronavirus lockdown for decades, says Carsten Junius, chief economist at Bank J. Safra Sarasin. In this special debate with my colleague Hannah Wise, three of Switzerland's top economists get together to look at the future of our economies.
Carl, in your recent economic outlook, you said that, if any country can get over this, it's Switzerland. But I'm wondering what use is that if the rest of Europe, the US, the world is dragging its feet?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, Switzerland is still very much dependent on what's going on around us, especially in Europe. And I said that because we have quite a lot of fiscal leeway. Switzerland could spend another 17% of GDP without even risking losing its AAA rating. So we could do a lot more on the fiscal side, but that's not what we actually wish for. We all wish for getting the economy open again, so that people can spend again and we get into a natural recovery mode here over the next couple of weeks. And for that to happen, we need to prevent a second wave. And that's a very difficult balancing act now as we go into opening the economy.
And is your outlook taking into account a second wave, Daniel?
We see the risk for it. Our base case still expects that we get into a recovery in the fourth quarter and into 2021. But of course, we know that we all could face a second lockdown, partial lockdowns again, which would just lead into a longer slump here. That's not our base case, but the risks are clearly there.
If there is a rapid rebound, could we be looking at more inflation? Marion Thompson.
Yes, of course we could. I certainly don't think inflation is dead. It's just that 100 things at the same time and hard to predict sometimes what the net will be. So we clearly have a very strong disinflationary impulse coming from the oil price. And, the other prices, such as food, for instance, has been going up if we're looking at the FAO's food price index. So this will affect different countries differently according to how they weigh those items in their consumption baskets. And the structural impulse on top of everything is, of course, the technological revolution that has tended to depress price increases now for quite some time. So this is also a very lucky circumstance that on top of everything else, we also do not contemporaneously have a huge inflation threat. But that's not to say that those underlying currents are not present.
But certainly, is inflation necessarily a bad thing? That's what the Swiss National Bank is, what the ECB have been working towards for many, many years, fairly unsuccessfully so far, Mary.
Yes, I know. The worst impact of inflation, I feel, is when it's result on what happens to people's wages and purchasing power. So as soon as you have even a little bit more inflation at the same nominal wage increase, you have a reduction in your purchasing power. And this is, of course, why it's every central bank's mission to aim for price stability, however we define price stability. So certainly I am definitely in the camp of the less inflation, the better. But then, of course, if we open up the conversation and start talking about how to get rid of the debt burdens, which of course will be a huge issue for most countries after this pandemic, well, then we understand that higher inflation makes it easier to repay that debt because it also, of course, devalues the real value of the debt that needs to be repaid. So okay. I think that we have 35 years probably. If you look at the Second World War experience, we have decades ahead of us, I would dare to purport, of arguably low inflation and low interest rates and probably negative real interest rates.
So, Carsten Junius, if I can leave the final word to you, how long will we be paying for the coronavirus crisis economically?
Oh, that will be the next 20 years. And but there will also be some benefits for some people, as I mentioned in the beginning, those that actually earn higher wages due to structural change, those companies that come up with new products that we need, not only the vaccines, but all the others that we need in order to increase our healthcare spending. And well, and unfortunately, there are also some people that have to pay for that higher debt. That is true.
And you can watch the full debate on our website, cnnmoney.ch. Now, turning to other headlines today, starting in Switzerland, nearly 30,000 people across Switzerland and Liechtenstein have now tested positive for the coronavirus, with 76 new cases recorded since Sunday. Now, over 1,470 people have died. These are all according to the latest figures from the Federal Office of Public Health. Now, the Federal Council has agreed to a special guarantee scheme to support cash-strapped startups hit by the pandemic. Based on the existing loan guarantee scheme for businesses, this program, announced by the Secretariat for Economic Affairs today, will see the government and cantons jointly guarantee up to 1 million Swiss francs per startup. And it's not back to school yet for another week, but for Swiss Parliament, it was back to work today after starting its 4-day extraordinary session. This time, though, swapping the Parliament building for the bigger conference center, Bern Expo, so that lawmakers could keep their distance. The session is dedicated to coronavirus and includes debates on some of the government decisions to date, including its multi-billion-dollar relief package. And Swiss pharma giant Roche has secured emergency approval from US regulators for its COVID-19 antibody test. The company said it will also scale up production, telling Reuters it expects to produce 100 million tests a month by the end of 2020. Roche also said today it will invest 400 million euros in a German site where it will also be manufacturing antibody tests. And Alliance World Leaders held a virtual pledging conference this afternoon to raise funds for a vaccine and treatments against coronavirus, the aim being to streamline national research efforts. The summit, which was being hosted this afternoon by the European Commission and other countries, including UK, Japan, Canada, and Norway, is looking to raise an initial 7.5 billion euros. It's a critical week for Lufthansa, which is hoping to conclude talks with the German government over a crucial multi-billion euro bailout package. This would come after the Swiss government has already pledged 1.27 billion in guarantees for Swiss and Edelweiss, both owned by Lufthansa. CNN's Fred Pleckton reports.
There is almost no place in Europe where you can see the coronavirus-induced crisis of the world's aviation industry better than here at the hub of Europe's largest airlines, Lufthansa, at Frankfurt in Germany. Now, what you can see behind me is a lot of parked planes, and as you can imagine, those planes are not getting any revenue right now, but those planes still cost a lot of money. Lufthansa still has to pay all the pilots. They have to pay all the ground staff. They still have to manage the fuel. And obviously, these planes still require a minimum amount of service as well. The airline says right now it's flying at less than 1% of its usual capacity. So normally they have about 350,000 passengers every day. Right now, they say that's around 3,000 passengers that they have every day, just to put that into perspective. Now, Lufthansa says that it needs government assistance. It says that it doesn't necessarily only need that assistance to get through this crisis, but also to be competitive after the crisis ends. And one of the reasons for that is that other airlines here in Europe and around the world have already secured government assistance. You look, for instance, at Air France and KLM. They're getting loan guarantees, they're getting loans and payroll assistance from the respective governments of France and of the Netherlands. And U.S. airlines are also getting assistance from the Trump administration as well. Lufthansa says it's confident that it can get through this crisis, but they do say that it is going to take several years and that this airline could look a lot different than it did before the coronavirus crisis. Fred Pleitgen, CNN, Frankfurt, Germany.
Swiss smart container manufacturer Skycell is the world's third largest pharma container provider and just raised 62 million Swiss francs to accelerate its global expansion. The company has also been involved in the shipping of a critical vaccine which prevents against a potentially life-threatening complication of the coronavirus. Skycell CEO spoke to my colleague, Tanya Koenig.
These containers transport pharmaceuticals such as vaccines around the world and are equipped with sensors that track their shipping conditions. Skycell is a Swiss tech company and the world's third largest pharma container provider. Now they just raised an additional 62 million Swiss francs to accelerate the company's global expansion.
So COVID-19 became a big accelerator because a lot of more countries had to stockpile more of the products. And we recently had very interesting moves where, for example, even governments were selling back certain products so that other governments in need could actually be supplied.
Can you give us an example of a recent transport that you did?
So we actually have two, I think, pretty good examples. One was for the largest vaccines manufacturer in the world, which we almost supply exclusively. They had their manufacturing plant is in Italy, and they had to move for the Brazilian government a lot of vaccination doses, roughly 4 million doses. They had to charter full planes. So you can imagine 3 big planes traveling to Brazil just with our containers on board and delivering these vaccines to one to Brazil, Brasilia, the capital, one to Belo Horizonte in the north, and one in Rio de Janeiro. And here we provided the full package from monitoring, from risk assessment to the actual containers, and then also helping them getting it off the ground. Mm-hmm. And the second one was that the German government was missing a key medication. So when you're in the hospital already with COVID-19, you're put on a respirator and you could fall into a longer coma. Then you have a high risk that you get some lung infections, and this vaccine specifically prevents it. And it was the German government was running short, and so they had to request from the Japanese government to call back that medication. And so we helped from the moment that the German government identified that until it was with the patient within 11 days. More than 320,000 doses were then brought to the various hospitals in Germany.
Can you walk us through what exactly you can track while it's in the air or being transported?
So pharmaceutical products are very temperature sensitive because modern pharmaceuticals are not chemicals. They are semi-living organisms, so-called biologics. And these are very temperature, humidity, and also to some degree vibration sensitive. And our containers protect from these environmental factors. And we also monitor these environmental factors. So when the container travels around the world, let's say from Basel to Brazil, via, for example, Miami, then we know what is the status of the container, what's the outside temperature, what's the inside temperature, what is the milestone, is the container still in order, or is there, for example, something that's not according to plan, and then someone from our operations team has to get involved and make adjustments.
And finally, plans for contact tracing apps are building up globally, but also in Switzerland. My colleague Olivia Cheng spoke to the head of global health at the World Economic Forum on the place of such apps in dealing with the crisis.
How effective do you see this being?
Well, it has not been voluntary everywhere in the world. I mean, if you take countries like Taiwan, for instance, it was not totally voluntary. I think we have been monitoring, I've seen people monitored during the quarantine periods with huge fines when they were leaving their homes, but also the monitoring of cell phones and outside of the homes, and actually additionally placing 1 or 2 calls to those very cell phones to verify that it was not about people leaving their phones at home and leaving their place. So I think I would not precisely call that voluntary. It's fairly rigid as a system. Now on the very topic of contact tracing, you know, it has been very, very human intensive as a process at this point in time. There have been armies of people doing contact tracing, and I was reading recently articles about the US where we talk about the need for 100,000 to 200,000 contact traces in the next year to actually enable an effective program. So obviously we need to use technology because it's not sustainable in the long run. And the problem with contact tracing applications, so for instance, the one that are doing short distance Bluetooth exchange between those cell phones, and when the patients would be identified that at that moment in time, you're going to retrieve that historical information and actually reconnect with all the ones that have been tagged as in contact with the patients. The problem with those apps is, to your point, that they are voluntary. And we have quite some solid evidence that until the moment in time where 60% or 70% of the population would actually, in a voluntary fashion, adopt those applications, then that would not be sufficient for enabling a good contact tracing program. So if you take the case of Singapore, for instance, when they have the Trace Together application being put in place, only 1 million in a population of 6 million have been adopting the app. And with 1 million, uptake, this application cannot be effective. So it's going to be a lot about education of populations about the use and the utility of those apps before we actually can totally rely on them. Until such time, that's going to be human-driven and very manual.
So in a nutshell, are you suggesting that Switzerland needs a compulsory contact tracing app?
Well, that's an interesting debate, right? I think if you are willing to rely on applications, you need 70% uptake. How do you do that? I mean, you can certainly rely on the level of civism of the population, which is well possible, and considering also where we have seen the level of discipline of the population during this semi-quarantine period. Or if you can't do that, you will have to use human bodies to actually be the detectives and trace those contacts in a very labor-intensive fashion.
And that is it for today. But as always, you can catch all our content on cnnmoney.ch or on our social media platforms. And as always, we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.